In the third week of May in 1981, on 160 acres of bottom ground along the Big Blue River in Saline County, Nebraska, a 58-year-old widow named Margaret Vance hauled a sack of seed corn out of a truck that no field in the county was idle enough to need. She paid $4.10 a bag in cash at the Crete elevator, 2 bags to the acre on the 30 she meant to plant first, loaded them into a 1974 International Harvester pickup, gone the dull red-brown of old rust, and drove home 11 miles on a dirt section road, past corn already 6 inches tall and dark green in every field she passed. Her own 30 acres were bare, black, worked, harrowed twice, and bare. It was the last week of May, and a man planted corn in Saline County in the last week of April, and every almanac and county agent for 4 townships knew it. Margaret Vance knew it too. She had farmed this ground beside her husband for 39 years and buried him in it. And she had read his handwriting on a wet night the December before, and chosen to plant a month late on purpose. The men at the Bohemian Cafe in Crete laughed for the length of 2 cups of coffee when they heard. Floyd Pellin said she had finally let the grief get the better of her judgment. Emil Wachal said the widow Vance was waiting for the corn to plant itself. Leland Sukup, who farmed the half-section that touched hers on the west and had wanted it for 9 years, did not laugh. He said it quietly into his cup that a woman alone would run a good farm into the ground inside 2 seasons, and a man ought to be ready to take it on when she did. They were still saying it on the 4th of July, and they were saying something else entirely by the middle of August, when a killing frost late in May had cut down the early corn in every field along the Big Blue, and a July that dumped 9 3/10 inches of rain on ground that could not drain had rotted and drowned what the frost had spared, and the only field of standing, tasseling green corn in Saline County, and most of the 2 counties bordering it, was the 30 acres the widow Vance had planted a month too late. She had read it in a leather ledger kept on this farm for 35 years, a daily record of the sky over this exact bottom ground, all of it in cramped pencil, and it had told her the cold was coming late and the water hard, and she had believed a dead man's weather before the living county. By the spring of 1981, the planting wisdom of southeastern Nebraska had reached the cleanest expression of its 100-year arc, and it was simple. You planted corn when the soil at 4 inches held above 50 degrees and the calendar had turned past the 3rd week of April, and you got it in fast, because the man who planted first caught the longest season and beat the August heat to pollination, and the one who planted last had broken down or did not love his ground. The county agent out of Wilbur, a careful young man named Dale Hrabick, said as much at the spring meeting in the Legion Hall. The data out of the university at Lincoln was unambiguous. Every day of delay past May 1st cost roughly 1 bushel an acre, and a farmer's whole job in April was to be ready and not to flinch. Margaret Vance sat in the 3rd row and did not say a word. She had brought the ledger in a flour sack on the truck seat and left it there, because there was no version of standing up in that hall and explaining that Henry had written in March of 1963 that the years the river fog lifted before the red-winged blackbirds came back were the years the late frost would bite, and that the redwings had come to her cottonwoods on the 8th of April this year, and the fog had hung in the bottoms until the last day of the month. There was no version of saying it out loud that did not end with Dale Hrabick looking at her with concern, and concern was only the clothing the laughter wore. So she went home and waited, and that was the thing none of them could stand. A man who plants late has failed. A woman who waits on purpose, with bare-worked ground and a full seed sack while every other field greens up around her, is doing something they had no word for, and what people cannot name they call madness. There was one thing in the ledger that Margaret did not understand, and it sat at the back of her mind all that spring and would not be shaken loose. The last full entry in Henry's hand was dated the 9th of February, 1979, 11 days before the stroke that took the use of his right side and ended the writing. After that, there were only 3 marks in the book, made in a shaky left-handed scrawl in the weeks before he died that October, and the last was not a weather note. It was a date alone on its own line near the back, the 22nd of June, with a single word beside it she could not read no matter how she turned the page to the lamp. She did not know why a dying man who had recorded 33 years of frosts had spent one of his last marks on a date in June that had not come yet, nor what was supposed to happen on it. Margaret had been raised on a different consensus than the cafe men, and it went back further than her husband. She was born Margaret Slavic in 1922, in a sod foundation farmhouse her grandfather built when he came over from Bohemia in 1887, in the emigration that had filled this corner of Nebraska with Czech names and put the word Bohemian on the cafe. Her grandfather Anton farmed by the sky and not the calendar, because in the old country a man who planted by a fixed date starved, and he taught her father, who had only the one daughter, and so taught her. He taught her the river fog and the blackbirds and the way the box elders held or dropped their seed. And when Margaret married Henry Vance in 1940, she brought 2 things to it: 40 acres her father deeded her, and a way of reading the year off the sky that no almanac carried. Henry was a Lincoln County boy who had farmed the Vance bottom by the agent's bulletins, and he had kept a plain weather diary on it since the spring of 1946, the daily high and low and the inch of rain, the careful record of a man who did not yet know what it was for. For the first years of the marriage he teased her about the signs gently, the harmless ribbing a man gives a wife. Then came the spring of 1953, when Margaret read the box elders and the late fog and told him to hold the corn back 2 weeks, and he laughed and planted on his old schedule, and a frost on the 11th of May took half his stand, while the corn she had badgered him into leaving in the bag went in late and made the best yield on the place. He was proud, but not stupid, and after that May he handed her a pen, and from then on the fog and the blackbirds went into the book beside the rainfall, his printing and her cursive alternating down the columns for 28 years, a marriage written in barometric pressure and first frost, and the date the Red Wings returned. Henry did not trust a thing he could not show twice, and by 1970 he had begun to draw conclusions out of the columns, the same kind of conclusions the university drew from its test plots, only his came off 30 years of one farm instead of 10 years of many. The strongest, underlined twice in the winter of 1971, was this: in any year, the river fog held past the 25th of April, and the Red Wings arrived before the 10th. The killing frost ran late into the final days of May. A wet July followed, and whoever planted on the calendar lost his corn to one or the other, or both. It had happened in 53 and 66, and milder in 74. 3 times in 30 years the sky had given the warning, and 3 times the late corn had lived. The winter after Henry died, Margaret read the whole ledger from the front, every page, by the kerosene lamp in the front room, because she could not bear the kitchen where his chair faced the window. She read it the way some widows read a Bible. And in the cold middle of December 1980, she understood that the signs Henry had underlined twice were stacking up again that spring, and that she would be alone in the county in knowing it. Her losses were not small and not over. Henry was gone 19 months. Their only son, David, had left for the assembly line in Lincoln in 1968 and married a town girl and did not farm and did not call, and the silence between them was the kind that has a date on it and a thing said that cannot be unsaid, and it had to do with the farm and who would take it and what David thought of a mother who would not sell. She had buried a husband, lost a son to a paint line 40 miles away, and was about to bet the whole next year and the loan that carried the farm through it on a dead man's handwriting. The cafe never knew the half of what she carried, and if they had, they would only have been surer she was breaking. She did the work at the end of April that a sane farmer does at the start. She serviced the 4-row John Deere check row planter she and Henry had bought, used in 1962, and could rebuild blind, and harrowed the 30 acres twice and let them lie. And on the morning of the 29th of April, she stood at the edge of the bottom field with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and watched the river fog refuse to lift until the sun was a full hand above the horizon, and heard the redwings already 3 weeks back rasping in the willows, and she went inside and wrote the date and the observation in her own hand on the next clean line after her dead husband's last shaking mark, and closed the book and waited. Leland Sukup saw the bare field from the road on the 3rd of May, a Sunday, driving his family home from Mass at St. Cyril and Methodius in Crete. He slowed the car. "Look at that," he said. "The Vance bottom is still black. The woman has not planted." Bessie looked at the worked black ground sliding past the window and said nothing, because she had grown up 2 miles from Margaret Slavic and knew whose granddaughter she was. And she suspected the black field was not neglect, but intention. And that intention in a widow frightened men in a way neglect never did. By the 2nd week of May, the talk had moved from the cafe to the elevator to the church steps and gone from amused to certain. Floyd Pelin kept a running joke that she was waiting for prices to come up before she committed, as if a woman could time a crop to the day a bank pays interest. Emil Watchall said his own corn was knee-high and asked, loud enough for the counter to hear, whether anybody had seen so much as a furrow on the Vance place. And every morning Leland Sukup sat apart and did the arithmetic that mattered to him. River bottom that good came up for sale twice in a man's life. A widow planting a month late would be at the bank by Christmas, and a patient man with cash and a fence line already on hers was the natural buyer. Margaret planted on the 24th and 25th of May. She started the planter at first light and ran the 30 acres in 2 long days, alone, 95-day hybrid, 2 bags to the acre. She had chosen that hybrid on purpose, too, a shorter season corn from the dealer in Friend, because corn planted that late had to make its grain before the first frost in early October, and full-season corn would still be milk in the ear when the cold came. The men who called her a fool did not credit that the fool had run the season math to the day. She had also planted 40 acres of full-season corn on schedule on the upland as a hedge, so the whole year did not ride on the theory. But the bottom was planted on the dead man's weather, and she told no living soul why. She drove to Crete on the 27th and went into the Bohemian Cafe, because she would not be a woman who could not buy a cup of coffee in her own county. The table went quiet. Floyd Pellin recovered first and said, "Well, Margaret, we were starting to think you'd quit farming." And Margaret set her coffee money on the counter and said, "No, Floyd, I planted Tuesday and Wednesday." Emil Washau said, "A month late." And Margaret said, "4 weeks and a day late, yes." And Leland Sukup, from the end, said it not unkindly, in the voice a man uses when he is sure he is being kind. "Margaret, Henry would have wanted somebody to say it to you plain, and you've nobody now, so I will. You've thrown the year away. Sell me the bottom before you owe more than it's worth, keep the home place, and you'll not do this again." Margaret looked at Leland over the rim of the cup. She had known him 40 years. "Henry would have asked me what my grandfather thought before he asked what the cafe thought," she said. "And my grandfather is in a book on the seat of my truck, and it says the frost runs late this year, and I planted for the year the book describes and not the year you wish it was." She finished the coffee, and she washed the cup herself at the end of the counter and set it in the rack, the way her mother had taught her never to leave a cup for another woman to clean, and walked out. And the table did not laugh until the screen door shut behind her. That night, Leland told his wife across the supper table that Henry Vance's widow had lost her mind, that she'd quoted her dead grandfather at him in the cafe, and planted a month late on the strength of a weather diary, and that somebody would have to look after the land when she failed. Bessie set down the bowl of dumplings she was carrying and said his whole name, slow and even, the warning of a wife who has reached the end of a thing. Leland Frank Sukup. That woman buried her Henry 19 months ago, and her father and mother before that, and her boy won't speak to her, and she is out there alone running a quarter section you have wanted since before Henry was cold, and you sit at my table and call her mad because she won't hand it to you. Anton Slavic read the sky on that bottom before your father owned an acre in this county. You go to her gate and say your piece to her face if you believe it, and then come home and leave her be. So Leland Sukup drove to Margaret Vance's gate on the 30th of May, 4 days after the frost whose size nobody yet understood, and he leaned on the top rail, and Margaret came out from the barn wiping her hands on a rag, and stood on her side of it. Leland said it plain, that the corn was a fool's bet, that grief made people do strange things, that the offer for the bottom stood and would not stand forever, and that he said it as a neighbor and not a buyer. Margaret heard him out without interrupting, which unsettled him more than argument would have. Then she answered him the way she answered everything that year, with the ledger. "The 8th of April, the Red Wings came to my cottonwoods, Leland," she said. "The fog held in this bottom till the last day of the month. Both are in the book in Henry's hand, as the sign of a late frost underlined before you or I knew this spring was coming. 3 times in 30 years this farm has seen those signs together, in 53 and 66 and 74, and 3 times the calendar corn died and the late corn lived, and it is written down with the dates where any man could read it, if any man would. I am not telling you so. You will agree with me. I am telling you what I am doing, so you do not have to ask me again, and so that when it comes out the way the book says, you will know I did not get lucky. I read it, My husband read it. My grandfather read it. You are standing at the gate of 3 generations who wrote down the sky and quoting me 100 years of a calendar. Leland stood at the rail a long moment. Then he said the thing he would remember saying, "Margaret, I cannot stop you, and I cannot help you, and I am going home, and I am going to watch what happens." And he drove the half-mile to his own place, where his own corn stood knee-high and dark green, and though he did not know it yet, already dead on its feet from a frost 4 nights gone, and he watched, as he'd said, for the rest of the summer. The frost had come on the night of the 26th of May. Margaret had known it would. She had brought her garden tomatoes under buckets the evening before, and stood in the yard at 10 at night, and felt the air go still and dry and dense before a radiation freeze, the wind dropping to nothing, the stars coming out hard and close. By morning there was white rime on the fence wire, and the hoods of the cars, and the leaves of every 6-inch corn plant in the bottoms. The Wilbur station fell to 28 degrees an hour before dawn, and held below freezing the better part of 3 hours, long enough to rupture the growing point of any young corn that had come far enough out of the ground to expose it. For the first week, the early corn did not look dead, and that was the cruelty of it. Frost-burned corn yellows at the tip, but the lower stalk stays green for days, and a hopeful man tells himself it will grow out. Emile Wachal told himself that. Floyd Pellin told himself that. But by the 8th of June, the new growth was twisted and pale, and a man who split the lower stalk with his thumbnail found the growing point gone brown and soft inside, and there is no coming back from that. The early corn had been killed standing, and it took until the middle of June for the men who planted it to admit what the rime on the wire had told the widow at dawn. Margaret's bottom was bare black ground that night, and there was nothing in it for the frost to kill. Her seed lay 1.5 inches deep in soil that does not freeze at that depth on one still spring night, and it germinated the first week of June. And by the time the early fields were being condemned with a thumbnail, her corn was spiking green, and even across the 30 acres, exactly on the dead man's schedule. The replanting started around the 10th of June, the late roar of tractors in fields that should have been laid by. A farmer who replants in mid-June is doing in a panic, on the worst date of the year, the very thing the widow had done in calm 3 weeks earlier, and several of the cafe men knew it and said nothing. Floyd Pellin, who had lost his whole stand, scraped together seed from the dealer and friend, the same hybrid Margaret had bought, and put it in on the 13th. The dealer told his wife it was the strangest sale of his life, selling a panicked Floyd Pellin the exact corn the widow he'd mocked had bought in May, and Floyd never once seeing the joke God was playing on him. And then, just as Margaret was beginning to let herself believe the first half of the book had proven out, the farm tried to take it back from her, and for 10 days in the last of June she thought she had been wrong about everything. It began with the rain, which the ledger had promised and which she had wanted. But it came harder than even Henry's worst wet July, 4 inches in 2 days starting on the 19th of June, and the Big Blue came up over its banks in the once-a-decade flood it makes when the rain falls faster than the bottoms can shed it, and the lowest 8 acres of her 30 went under brown water for 2 days and a night. She stood at the field edge in the rain on the morning of the 21st and watched the muddy water standing among her corn, and the fear came up in her that she had been a proud, stupid, lonely old woman who had bet the farm on her dead husband's diary and lost it to the rain, the diary bragged of predicting. 2 days submerged in June heat will kill young corn as dead as any frost. She had planted the river edge to the theory, and the theory was drowning it while she watched. She went back to the house, wet through, and did the only thing she knew how to do, which was open the book. And there, in the wet July entries, she found what she had read past all winter, because it had not mattered to her until that morning. Henry's note from the flood year of 1951, that the bottom 8 along the river will drown in a wet June, and you must not count them. The corn that pays is the high 22 the water never reaches. He had drowned this exact 8 acres and 51 and written it down so that 30 years later, his widow, standing in the same flood, would know the loss was priced in, a footnote inside the theory, and not the failure of it. The high 22 acres, the part of the bottom that lifted a few feet above the river, were never under water at all, and the rain, drowning the 8, was soaking them just as the ledger said, setting the crop up for the dry August to come. Margaret did not save the 8 acres. She let the river have them, as Henry had told her to 30 years before she needed telling, and she counted the 22, and they were sound. But the 10 days cost her the certainty. She had stood over that brown water and doubted the whole structure of her year, the book and the grandfather and the redwings and her own stubbornness, pulled back only by a sentence a dead man wrote in 1951. After that morning, she farmed like a woman who knew exactly what she had wagered, and that the book could be right about the year and still cost her dearly inside its rightness. The flood at the river edge was only the front of the wet July the book had promised. It rained 9 days out of 31, and the gauge at Wilbur finished the month at 9 3/10 inches, more than double the July normal. On Margaret's high 22 acres, the corn loved it, rooting deep and reaching for its growth in the exact wet, warm weeks it had been planted to hit. And by the end of July, it was tasseling, shoulder-high and dark and even. On the replanted early fields, the wet July did the second half of the killing. June planted corn on heavy bottom ground that cannot drain, sits in saturated soil, and saturated soil has no air in it, and roots that cannot breathe stop growing, yellow the plants, and open them to the root rots that thrive in standing water. Emile Wachal's replanted 40 acres never made a stand worth the diesel he'd spent, and Floyd Pillen's 13th of June corn came up and then sat, ankle-deep in mud, 3 weeks behind even where it lived. The men who had replanted in a panic watched the rain they would have welcomed in a normal July finish what the frost had started, because corn planted that late on that ground had no margin left. By the first week of August, the situation was plain to anybody who would drive the section roads and look. Margaret walked her 22 acres every morning in the dry heat that had come right on the ledger's schedule, the long, clear high that always follows a wet July in that country, and she watched her corn pollinate in it exactly as it was meant to. The county agent, Dale Hrabick, drove the bottoms in mid-August taking notes for his loss report, and he came over a rise on the section road and saw, after 30 miles of brown and stunted ruin, a single rectangular block of tall, dark green tasseled corn standing in the river bottom, a piece of some different and better year, set down whole in the middle of the ruin, and he stopped his car in the road and stood at the fence a long time before he knew whose place it was. It was the Widow Vance's, the bottom that had been black and bare, and the joke of the Bohemian Cafe in May, and it was the only field of healthy standing corn Dale Hrabick found in 3 days of driving the county. He found Margaret in the barn and asked her plainly how. And Margaret, who had not explained herself to a single living soul all spring, looked at the agent, who in March had called the calendar unambiguous, and decided he had earned the answer by driving 30 miles and believing his own eyes. She brought in the flour sack and set the ledger on the workbench under the barn light and opened it to the page in Henry's hand, underlined twice, and let him read. He read it the better part of an hour at the workbench, not speaking, his finger going down the columns and back to the years she had named, and twice he took off his glasses and set them on the page and looked at the ledger as if it might change. When he closed the cover, he kept his hand flat on it. "The university has nothing like this," he said. "We have 10 years of plot data from a research farm. You have 35 years of the actual sky over the actual ground." He asked to bring the Lincoln people out to the book and the field. Then he stopped, and the next part came harder. "I'd ask you not to use my name, not yet," he said, looking at the dirt floor and not at her. "I stood up in that Legion Hall in March and told this whole county the calendar was all of it, and I have spent 3 days driving past dead corn to stand in your barn and find out how much it leaves out." Margaret said he could be Cooperator A in his own report and welcome, and Dale Hrabick came near to a smile for the first time since the spring meeting, and he came back 4 times that fall. The corn came off the cob in the closing days of October, exactly as the season math had said, in May. Margaret picked the 22 acres alone over 3 long days, and the high bottom everyone had written off made 141 bushels to the acre in a year when the county average, dragged to the floor by the dead early fields and the drowned replants, came in under 40. Her upland 40, the on-schedule hedge, sat high enough that the cold had drained off it on frost night, and it made a fair 90. The widow Vance brought in the best corn in the county in the worst corn year in a generation, and paid off the operating loan at the Crete Bank in November with the early discount. And the banker, a sober man named Vince Cuxera, told the story at his own supper table because he could not help it. The first man to her gate after the harvest was not Leland Sukup. It was Leland's son. Walter Sukup was 29 that fall, and he farmed alongside his father on the home half-section, and he had watched the whole summer from across the fence line the way his father had, except that Walter had drawn a different lesson. He drove to Margaret's place on a Saturday in early November, and he did not lean on the gate. He came to the porch with his cap in his 2 hands against his chest. "Mrs. Vance, my father didn't send me," he said. "He doesn't know I'm here. I came on my own. He said his family had lost most of their corn like everybody else, that he would farm that ground when his father couldn't, and that he had stood at the fence in August and understood she knew something his whole education did not, and he wanted to learn it before it died with her." Margaret looked at the son of the man who had stood at her gate in May and called her mad, and she brought him into the kitchen and made coffee and put the ledger on the table. She told him she was not in the business of giving away 35 years for nothing, because a thing given free is a thing not valued, and Henry had taught her that too. She would teach him to read the book, the redwings and the river fog, and the box elders and the barometric runs, one Saturday afternoon a season, and in exchange he would give her 4 days at the next harvest at $3.10 an hour, the going wage, because she was 58 and would not always pick 22 acres alone. Walter agreed to all of it at the table that Saturday, and the arrangement held for the rest of her life. By the next spring, 2 more young farmers and a man over in Gage County had asked the widow Vance the same question, and she charged them the same and taught the same book. Still, the date near the back of the ledger sat unread, in Henry's shaking left hand, with the one word she could not make out. It nagged at her through the harvest and into the winter, because she had now lived through the June it pointed at, and nothing had marked it, no frost, no flood, and she had begun to think it the wandering mark of a dying man, and to be ashamed of how much she had wanted it to mean something. It was Walter who solved it on a Saturday in December, bent over the ledger learning to read the old entries. He held the back page up to the window light the way she had 100 times, and he said, "Mrs. Vance, this isn't a weather mark, and it isn't a name." The word beside the 22nd of June was 3 letters and a number in Henry's failing hand, and once Walter said them aloud, they were unmistakable and had been under her eyes for 2 years, D-A-V, and the number 40, David, their son. And the 40 was not a quantity, it was an age. David Vance would turn 40 years old on the 22nd of June, 1981. Henry, dying in the autumn of 1979 with only a little hand left, had spent one of his last marks not on the weather, but on his son's 40th birthday, 2 years out, in the one book he knew his wife could not stop reading. He had not been able to fix the silence between Margaret and David, but he had written the boy's name and his coming birthday where she would surely find it, asking her, in the only ink he had left, not to let their son turn 40 a stranger. The date had come and gone that summer in the thick of the flood and the doubt, and she had let it pass. And her son had turned 40 in a rented house in Lincoln, 40 miles away, and she had not called. She sat with the ledger a long time by the kerosene lamp that December evening after Walter had gone home, and the next morning she drove the 11 miles of section road and the 40 miles of highway, the flour sack on the seat beside her, and knocked on her son's door for the first time in 4 years. What was said in David Vance's front room belongs to the 2 of them, and not to a story about corn. But David came home for Christmas that year, the first time since the funeral. With his town wife and the grandchildren Margaret had met twice, and he walked the frozen bottom field with his mother, and she showed him in the snow where the river took the low 8 and where the high ground held, and told him of his father's mark in the back of the book. The boy who would not farm and the mother who would not sell stood in the field that had outlived the argument between them, and the silence that had a date on it was, if not undone, set down. Leland Sukup came to the gate himself in the spring of 1982, a year to the week after the conversation across the rail, on a Saturday alone, with his Stetson in his hand and not on his head. It cost the old man to stand at the gate of the widow he had told to sell, and he said it plainly. "Margaret, I came to ask your forgiveness. I stood at this gate a year ago and told you grief had taken your judgment, and you told me you'd read the year out of a book, and I'd read it off a calendar, and you were right, and the whole county was wrong, and I have wanted my whole life to be the kind of man who could tell the difference, and last May I could not." He asked if she would let him come one Saturday afternoon a season like the young ones did, and learn what he should have learned in 1953, when the same thing happened to her Henry, and he was too young to notice. Margaret looked at him a long moment, the way she had across the cafe counter the year before. Then she said, "You were forgiven, Leland, on the night last May that Bessie sent you over here to say your piece to my face. A man who'll come to the gate and say a hard thing he believes is a man who can be taught." It was Floyd and Emil laughing into their coffee that I had no use for. You came and stood where I could answer you. She opened the gate. "Come in, the coffee's on, and bring your wife next time. I owe Bessie more than I owe you." And Leland came in, one Saturday a season for the 11 years he had left. And when he died in 1993, his obituary in the Crete News said he had asked, in his last years, to learn from his neighbor, Margaret Vance, and that the high bench at the edge of the Vance bottom, where an old man liked to sit and watch the river corn, was to be called the Sioux Cup Bench, which it still is to the few who remember why. The Crete News ran the story in the second week of November in 1981, 19 column inches, under a headline that the widow Vance had read the weather out of a 35-year ledger and made the only crop in the county. Dale Hrobick was quoted as Cooperator A at first, and then by the second printing under his own name, because the honest thing was to stand up in the county where he had called the calendar unambiguous and say what August had shown him at her fence. The university people came the following spring and spent 2 summers on the ledger and the field, and they published a paper Margaret was named in, and the Red Wing and Fog conclusion Henry had drawn out of those columns held up under their instruments better than anyone in Lincoln expected a farm couple's pencil notes could. Margaret farmed the bottom for 11 more years, and twice more the Red Wings came early and the Fog held late, and she planted a month behind the county and was proven right once and half right once, because a thing read by a human being is never certain, only better than the alternative. She kept the ledger in her own hand until the year before she died. The book did not go in the ground with her. She left it to Walter, with the conclusions copied out and a letter, and Walter Sukup farms that bottom still and plants it by the sky and not the calendar. There is a man in Saline County under 50 who can stand at the margin of a river field in April and tell you from the blackbirds and the fog what the sky means to do in May, because a widow nobody believed taught him out of her dead husband's book. The reason her corn lived when the counties died was never hidden, and that is the part worth sitting with. It was not luck, and it was not a gift, and it was not a secret. It was written down in a cramped pencil hand since 1946. The Red Wings and the Fog, the late frost and the wet July, underlined twice in the winter of 1971, riding in a flour sack on a truck seat all that spring, waiting for somebody to do the one thing the whole county could have done, and only she would. Read it and believe it and plant a month too late on purpose and stand at your own gate while the men you have known for 40 years tell you that you have lost your mind, and wait for the sky to settle the argument the way the book said it would. If you have ever known a person who rid the land better than the experts, who kept a record nobody else thought to keep, and was proven right in a hard year, leave a comment and tell us what it was and where, the county and the year. And if a story like this is the kind of thing you want to keep hearing, subscribe and ring the bell, because there is one of these in every county in America, a woman who held a farm together when nobody thought she could, and we are working through them one harvest at a time.